My name is Laura Carter. I'm 26 years old. I've lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin my entire life, and I've always considered myself a rational person. I never believed in rituals, in thin boundaries between worlds, in signs, or in the dead returning. To me, all of that was just a way to escape reality when it becomes unbearable. What truly frightened me was something else: people who can't let go. I always thought grief followed a certain logic. First pain, then denial, anger, emptiness, and eventually acceptance. Like a broken bone, it hurts, but if you leave it alone and give it time, it heals. I believed people always return to reality if you don't interfere, if you don't feed their fears or fantasies. I was irritated by talk of feeling a presence, by dreams that were supposedly meaningful, by voices that came at night. I called it psychological compensation, a way for the brain to survive loss without losing its mind. I was convinced of one thing: the most dangerous part isn't death itself, but the refusal to accept it. I wasn't afraid of the dead. I was afraid of the living who cling to those who are already gone, afraid of the moment when pain stops being pain and turns into a decision. I thought I would always be able to recognize that moment, that there was a clear line between healthy grief and madness. But I was wrong. Now, I know that sometimes the line disappears quietly, so quietly that you only notice it's gone when you're already standing on the other side. I had been friends with Rachel Moore for a long time. We met before college and stayed close even when life pulled us in different directions. Rachel was always different from me. She felt everything more deeply when she was happy. It brought her to tears. When she was afraid, she felt it in her entire body. When she lost someone, it was as if a part of her disappeared with them. I, on the other hand, always kept a slight distance from my own emotions, as if I were observing them from a safe place. When she met Ryan Wright, he was 27, and everything happened fast, too fast, even for Rachel. Within a few months, they moved into a rented apartment in a high-rise building with windows overlooking the city and constant noise behind the glass. From the outside, it looked like a normal young couple's life. Dinners after work, conversations about plans, about a bright future together, about how important it was just to stay afloat for now and get on their feet. At first, Ryan seemed calm and put together. He didn't talk much, listened carefully, and always tried to be helpful. But over time, I started to notice changes. His career wasn't going anywhere. Interviews, rejections, short-term gigs that never lasted more than a few weeks. Each failure seemed to take something living out of him. In conversation, he began calling himself a failure more and more often, speaking quietly, without drama, but with a kind of final certainty. He kept saying he wouldn't be able to give Rachel the life she deserved, that he was temporary, wrong, unnecessary in her future. It didn't sound like complaining, it sounded like a sentence he had passed on himself. Rachel tried to reassure him, to support him, to convince him that things would get better. And I caught myself with a strange feeling, as if a crack had formed in their relationship, one that only he could see and that kept widening every day, even though on the surface everything still looked almost normal. When I learned about Ryan's death from Rachel, everything felt terrifyingly calm. There were no screams, no chaos, none of the confusion that usually comes with news like that. It all happened as if following instructions. A phone call, short phrases, a pause between words where the mind refuses to accept what it's hearing. What struck me most in that moment wasn't the news itself, but Rachel's tone, flat, almost ordinary. He left a farewell note. I saw it later, in Rachel's apartment. A few sheets of paper, neat handwriting, No signs of haste or despair. No accusations. No hysteria. No attempt to shift blame. He wrote that he couldn't end their relationship because he loved her. But he also couldn't continue building a future together without believing in that future. He said that staying close while constantly feeling like a burden was unbearable for him. The most frightening part was how logical it all sounded, as if he had simply made a decision, not ended his life. There was no request for forgiveness, not a single "I'm sorry." Just a dry explanation, like someone summing things up. Along with the note, he left his cross on a thin chain, the same one he always wore and never took off, even at home. Small, darkened with age, with faint scratches on the surface. I remember it lying on the table next to the note, and for some reason, it was that object that sent a chill through my chest, as if he hadn't just left behind a thing, but a part of himself. He was buried in an old, nearly forgotten cemetery on the outskirts of the city, not because that's what his family wanted, and not because there was no space elsewhere. It was simply where people with that kind of cause of death were often laid to rest off to the side, far from manicured paths and fresh flowers, without questions or explanations. It felt like a place where the city stored things it didn't want to remember. The cemetery looked neglected, even in daylight. Faded names on headstones, leaning crosses, old fences choked with weeds pushing through the metal. There was no sense of peace there, only a silence that felt unnatural. The air was heavy, as if it hadn't moved in a very long time. People rarely came there. No random passers-by, no children's voices, no traffic beyond the fence. The place existed apart from the city, as if an invisible boundary separated it from the living. A place that wasn't spoken about. One people tried to erase from memory as soon as the burial was over. I remember thinking at the time how painfully symbolic it was, as if he hadn't just been buried, but pushed aside so far away that even the memory of him wouldn't interfere with life going on. Rachel didn't accept his death. It was obvious almost immediately, but I stubbornly refused to call it dangerous. She didn't talk about Ryan being gone, or even about him no longer existing. She kept saying something else, that he wasn't here, as if this wasn't about death at all, but about a temporary absence, a delay, a mistake that could still be fixed. She said she would give anything for just one conversation with him. Not to bring him back, not for a second chance. Just to hear his voice again, to see him standing beside her, even for a single minute. There was no hysteria in her words. On the contrary, they sounded quiet and focused, as if she were thinking through a plan rather than sharing her pain. I tried to explain it to myself with simple logic. The first stage of grief denial. The mind looking for a way not to accept the loss, postponing it, hiding it behind different words. I told myself it would pass with time, that one morning she would wake up and say, "He's gone," and those words would finally become real. But instead, her thoughts began circling around a single idea. She often fell silent in the middle of a conversation, staring at one spot, thinking. When I asked what was on her mind, Rachel answered vaguely, or smiled, as if I were missing something obvious. I didn't know then that she was already looking for a way to bring him back. Not in memories, not in dreams, but for real, at any cost. One evening, Rachel told me she had spoken to a woman people go to when they no longer know what to do with their loss. She didn't give her name and didn't explain how she had found her. She wasn't a witch, not a blogger, not another online healer. Just a person who had spent years listening to broken people and talking to them about things that are usually left unsaid. Rachel said the woman didn't promise miracles and didn't talk about bringing the dead back to life. She didn't use dramatic language or scare her with consequences. She spoke calmly about connections that don't simply break on their own, about how death doesn't always mean complete absence, but sometimes only a change in the form of presence. What unsettled me most was the way Rachel repeated her words, as if it hadn't been a conversation, but an instruction. The woman said that sometimes it's possible to bring back a presence, not the person, not the body, but the feeling that someone is near. To do that, the body needs to be given an object it had in life, something it remembers. Not a symbol, not a random item, something that had become part of the person. I felt an immediate Vnutrani resistance. It sounded dangerous even in theory, but Rachel talked about it without excitement and without fear, as if she were describing something ordinary. She kept repeating that the woman had warned her about the risks, that things don't always turn out the way you expect. But I saw something else. Rachel heard only one thing. It could work. One day, Rachel pulled the cross out of her pocket and silently placed it in my palm. The same one Ryan had worn all the time and left behind with the note. The metal was cold, heavier than I remembered, as if it had absorbed more than just the warmth of skin. Rachel said it was the right thing for the ritual. Her voice was steady, without hesitation, as if the decision had been made long before this conversation. She asked me to help, not to participate, not to believe, just to be there. I automatically pictured something foolish and almost harmless, a visit to the cemetery, a few words at the grave, silence, and then going home. I told her right away that I didn't want to take part in it. What scared me wasn't even the idea itself, but how seriously Rachel was taking it. But when I looked into her eyes, I understood. She had already decided. She would do it with me or without me. There was no pleading in her gaze, only exhaustion and a strange certainty. I had the sudden sense that if I refused, she would go there alone, with nothing to stop her. I agreed only because I was afraid to leave her alone with that idea. I told myself I wouldn't take part in any ritual. I would just stay nearby, make sure she didn't hurt herself, make sure nothing got out of control. I truly believed that would be enough. I don't remember how we got to the cemetery that night. My mind erased large parts of it, as if they were never there. But the horrors I witnessed, I will never forget those. The night was quiet. The sky was sealed with thick clouds, and the air was cold. At the cemetery, Rachel moved quietly, with focus. As we approached the grave, I slowed down and stopped a few steps away. Rachel stood by the grave and began speaking words in another language slowly, clearly, without hesitation. I didn't understand a single word, but her tone was steady, almost calm. I stayed back and waited for it to end. For a moment, I even thought I was overreacting, that it looked ridiculous, strange, but ultimately harmless. For an instant, the rustling of the trees vanished. We were swallowed by absolute silence, and all I could hear was her voice. I glanced at my watch, counted the seconds, and imagined us leaving soon, this whole thing becoming just another strange episode of grief. Then Rachel fell silent. She stepped aside and pulled a shovel out of the bushes. It had been hidden there in advance, placed carefully, as if it had been waiting for its moment. Something inside me snapped. I understood then that this wasn't an impulse or an emotional breakdown. She knew exactly what she was doing, and just as clearly, I realized something else. I was no longer going to be able to stop her. After Rachel pulled out the shovel, time in my head seemed to break. Events stopped forming a sequence and shattered into separate fragments that wouldn't connect. I remember the sound of metal cutting into the earth. I remember Rachel's heavy, ragged breathing. I remember my own pulse pounding in my ears so loudly it drowned out every other thought. I couldn't move. Not because I didn't want to, I didn't even get the chance to decide. Fear held me tighter than any logic or will ever could. My body refused to respond, as if someone had pressed pause on me alone. I stood there and watched clumps of dirt fly aside, watched the hole grow deeper, watched the night around us seem even darker. At some point, I stopped trying to understand what was happening. I stopped looking for explanations or excuses. There were no thoughts left in my head, only a dull awareness of motion, repetition, process. I watched my friend dig, and suddenly I realized something with terrifying clarity. She had already crossed a line I believed was impossible to cross. And I was standing right there beside her, not stopping her. When she reached the coffin, her reaction was nothing like what I had feared. She didn't scream. She didn't step back. There was no shock, no panic. I heard Rachel slide the lid aside, and then I heard her cry. Quiet, broken, but filled with relief, as if she had finally found the one she had been searching for all this time. There was no horror in that sound. If anything, there was a hidden joy. I stood a few steps away and couldn't see what was inside the grave. But even from there, I could smell the damp earth, heavy and wet, mixed with something sweet, cloying, and sickening. That smell didn't belong there. It cut through the air and crept into my lungs, forcing me to breathe shallowly, carefully. Rachel leaned down and began to whisper. She said his name softly, the same way she had when he was alive. Her voice trembled, but not with fear. Forcing myself forward, I took a few steps closer. My legs felt numb, each movement slow, as if I were walking through thick water. I reached the edge of the grave and looked down. Rachel was touching his hand, pressing herself against his chest, kissing him. To her, it wasn't a body. It wasn't remains. It was Ryan, the same Ryan she loved, silent now, but still him. In that moment, nausea hit me hard. I turned away abruptly and dropped to my knees, my palms sinking into the cold earth as I tried not to look, not to breathe too deeply. I wanted desperately to rush toward her, to grab her, to pull her away, to force her to face reality. But my body refused to move again. I had become a witness to something so horrifying that it was enough for a lifetime. From that moment on, I could no longer look at Rachel the way I once had. She placed the cross inside the coffin. I remember that moment more clearly than anything else. Not because it was dramatic or sudden, on the contrary, the movement was almost ordinary. But right then, something inside me screamed, without sound or words. I realized we had crossed a line, not a symbolic one, not an imagined one, a real line one there was no way back from. When Rachel stood up and looked at me, I saw a white maggot slowly sliding down her lip. She didn't notice it at all. I said nothing. I just stared, unable to react, as if my mind refused to absorb one more detail. Rachel began to bury everything again. The earth fell into the grave with dull, heavy thuds, covering what was meant to remain hidden. Her hands were shaking, but her voice had grown calm. Not hysterical, not forced. Real, steady. She spoke slowly, almost gently, as if she were soothing someone, not me, but someone else. She said that he had heard her. I didn't respond. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, I would be admitting my role in this. Not silent presence, not fear, not helplessness, but complicity. And then I would have to accept that I hadn't just been there. I had become part of it. We left the cemetery in silence. Neither of us looked back. The night now felt ordinary, too ordinary for what had just happened. The roads were lit by streetlights. Windows glowed in the distance. Cars passed by. The city went on with its life as if nothing had occurred. That was what frightened me the most. The world didn't stop. It didn't shudder. Everything stayed exactly where it was. We called a taxi. Inside the car, it was quiet. I sat staring into the darkness beyond the window, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Rachel silently examined her hands as if she were seeing them for the first time. She carefully cleaned the dirt from beneath her fingernails, scraping it away with the nails of her other hand, slowly, deliberately, focused. A faint smile appeared on her face, not joyful, not nervous, calm. When she finally spoke, I heard confidence and relief in her voice, as if a heavy weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She behaved as if she had done something right, and I sat beside her, unable to shake the feeling that we had brought something back from the cemetery, something that should never have returned to the city. Over the following days, I kept repeating to myself that nothing could have happened, that it had only been an act of desperation, strange and terrifying, but empty. That no ritual could change anything if you didn't believe in it. I clung to that thought like a lifeline and forced myself to keep living, pretending it was all behind us. But from that moment on, Rachel began to change. Not suddenly, not in ways that were obvious at first. The changes were quiet, almost delicate. And that was what terrified me most. One day, Rachel and I met at a cafe. We talked about neutral things, everyday topics, and she looked noticeably better. For a moment, it seemed to me that grief was finally starting to loosen its grip on her. But then, casually, Rachel said she had seen Ryan in a dream. She mentioned it in passing, as if it were something ordinary and unimportant. Then she added that she had heard his voice when she woke up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, not with fear, but the way someone softly calls your name. She didn't look frightened. On the contrary, it seemed like being near him made her feel calmer, more at peace, as if something she had lost had returned to her life. Rachel said that it was hard for Ryan to be here, that it hurt him to remain between worlds, that he wanted to go back, but at the same time, he was glad to be near her again. She relayed his words as if she were simply retelling a conversation that had happened in the kitchen or in the car. According to her, Ryan regretted what he had done. He said he shouldn't have gone that far, that he wanted to be together. Her eyes lit up as she spoke. I tried to hold on to rationality. I explained everything as hallucinations, as the aftermath of trauma, as guilt manifesting itself. I spoke confidently, almost professionally, choosing my words carefully. I believed that if I sounded convincing enough, reality would eventually align with my explanations. But every time I was near Rachel, it felt like someone else was there too. Not a sound, not a shadow, a presence. It pressed against the air, making it feel thicker, heavier. One day, when I walked into her apartment, I distinctly smelled Ryan's cologne, the same one he had worn for years. The scent was so real that I stopped in the doorway. At that moment, Rachel was happily moving around the apartment, cooking something in the kitchen. Everything looked almost normal. Almost, if not for the bowl of raw earth sitting on the table among vegetables and spices, as if it were as natural to her as salt or flour. The smell of the cologne mixed with the scent of damp soil, exactly the same as it had been that night at the cemetery. A chill ran over my skin, and cold sweat broke out across my back. That evening, I didn't stay long at Rachel's place. While she was baking something in the oven, I complained about a stomachache and left her apartment as quickly as I could. 2 days passed after my last meeting with Rachel, and that was when my life changed forever. The first time I saw Ryan, it was by accident. Not his face, just a reflection. A movement in glass. A shadow that didn't match any source of light. The sensation that someone was standing far too close behind me. It lasted a second, maybe less. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't tell Rachel anything. I decided that if I said it out loud, it would become real. As long as I stayed silent, I could blame it on exhaustion, fear, strain. But with each passing day, he became clearer. The presence no longer faded right away. It lingered in the room, in corners, in reflections. I caught myself looking not where Rachel was standing, but slightly to the side toward where something was, and the worst part wasn't even that. No, he wasn't speaking only to her. At first, I thought I was just hearing her words and imagining the rest. But eventually, I realized the tone was different. Not hers. He spoke as if he knew I could hear him, as if it was allowed, as if I had already become part of the connection. Ryan kept repeating the same things, that he loved Rachel, that being here hurt, that staying between worlds was unbearable. He talked about going back, but now he added something new, that he didn't want to return alone. He said it was easier together, more right, that Rachel shouldn't be here without him. And every time I heard it, I felt that those words weren't meant only for her. It was as if someone was preparing me for a decision I hadn't yet realized I was being pushed toward. After some time, I began to notice that Rachel was giving in. There was no strength left in her words, only exhaustion. She said that being near him was quiet, that there was no constant pressure there, no noise, no need to prove anything or endure. And here, in the world of the living, everything was too loud, too heavy, too full of pain that never went away. I tried to hold on to her. I talked about the future, about life, about how pain changes with time. I spoke quickly, nervously, as if my words could become a wall between her and whatever was calling to her. But every conversation ended the same way. Rachel looked somewhere past me, slightly to the side, and listened. Not to me, to someone else. In those moments, I felt unnecessary, irrelevant, like a silent background. And along with that came guilt. It grew slowly, wrapping itself around my thoughts like something alive. I blamed myself for the cemetery, for the shovel I didn't take away, for not running, for not forcing her to leave with me, for standing there and watching when I still could have changed something. Over and over, I replayed that night in my mind, searching for the moment when I should have stopped everything, and every time, I reached the same conclusion. I didn't pull her back then, and now I was losing her all over again. The turning point came on the day Rachel stopped answering my calls. At first, I tried to calm myself. Maybe she was busy. Maybe her phone was on silent. Maybe she was asleep. But hour after hour passed, and the silence didn't change. I went to her apartment without warning, with a growing sense that I was already too late. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the apartment was unnaturally quiet and far too cold. When I stepped into the room, the first thing I saw was the window wide open. That wasn't right. It was cold outside, and Rachel always kept it closed, even in the summer. I moved closer, slowly, as if delaying the moment of understanding. I looked down and realized I no longer needed to search for Rachel inside the apartment. I didn't panic. Instead, a strange numbness clouded my mind. I understood that what had happened was exactly what I had feared ever since the ritual. Ryan had convinced her after all. He had taken my friend with him. Now they were together again. But at what cost? After the tragedy, they began to appear to me together. Not constantly, and not intrusively. In silence. In the kind of exhaustion that comes late at night. In those moments when I was alone and no longer had the strength to keep my thoughts under control. I didn't see them clearly, I felt them instead. Two presences standing side by side, bound to each other. They didn't pressure me or ask. They didn't beg or threaten. They spoke calmly, almost gently. They said it was hard here, that this world was too loud and too cold, and that there it was quiet. There, nothing hurt, and there was no need to struggle every day. They said I already knew how it worked, that the crossing wasn't as frightening as it seemed. Their voices blended together, and I couldn't always tell who was speaking. Sometimes it felt like they were simply sharing something obvious, not calling me at all. But every time I was left alone, I felt the same thing. They were waiting, and they were calling me to join them. Right now, I'm standing just one step away from crossing that same line. I'm still living in the real world. I walk the streets of Milwaukee. I go to work. I answer messages. I buy coffee in the morning. But beside me, constantly, are those who should no longer be here. They don't disappear completely, and they don't appear openly. They simply exist in the silence, in the darkness, in the spaces between my thoughts. With each passing day, their words sound more convincing. They don't promise happiness, only peace. They don't speak of escape, only rest. Of a place where you don't wake up with pain in your chest or guilt that makes it hard to breathe. They know exactly where to press. They know that I feel responsible. The thought that Rachel left because of me is eating me alive from the inside. If I hadn't gone with her to the cemetery, if I had stopped her, if I had screamed, run, called for help, if I hadn't stayed silent, those if-onlys have become the background noise of my life, growing heavier with every day. Each new day here becomes harder to endure. It feels as though the world is pushing me away, while the silence behind me is calling. I'm still holding on to rationality, to logic, to fear of finality. But I already know the line exists, and I know it's closer than it seems. I don't know if I'll take that step into nothingness tomorrow. All I know is that they're waiting for me. So, did you like the story? Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe you'd like to hear a continuation? Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and support me on Patreon. That's where you'll find exclusive content, especially the kind YouTube doesn't allow.